Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video with Isaac and Friends. Now, I know it's been just all kinds of stuff today, and matter of fact, I'm aware that we've been doing a lot of these Jehovah's Witness style videos, but I am an ex-JW, so a lot of the different news going on is kind of important to me. So, recently, it's been making around news that Sweden has removed the Jehovah's Witnesses as a religion in their nation. Now, while this is a big W for a lot of XJWs, because the fact that it is being done specifically because of the shunning and the ostracism that the Watchtower does and teaches and indoctrinates into its people. In fact, I myself am a victim of that because my own family doesn't talk to me because of the same teaching. But there's something I want to really think and say that is probably a much bigger problem for the Watchtower than just shunning. You see, the Watchtower has been doing some things it really shouldn't. In fact, things that it's not telling its followers at all. One of those things is that it's using money that is supposed to be donated for the care of the kingdom halls and various religious practices and preaching work for investments. In fact, thanks to our lovely friends at we know for a fact that they've been doing this. In fact, we see 3 different investment and asset firms that have been built in Ireland using very, how should we say, prestigious JW figures. This, as well as paying for several different, how should we say, CSA and SA lawsuits and settlements, which are also not disclosed to donors, not disclosed to any member at all. In fact, any mention of this is almost universally shut down in any kingdom hall that you would ever go to. In fact, elders, ministerial servants, and more have been straight up silenced because of this. Now, you might ask, well, Isaac, why does this have anything to do with Sweden? And I'm glad that you asked that. You see, the Watchtower is able to hide all of this because of their tax-exempt status. However, now that their tax-exempt status as a religion has been removed in Sweden, it means that next year the Watchtower will have to pay taxes. And because the Watchtower as a tax-exempt entity has never had to A, pay taxes, or B, face an audit, which means that the Swedish version of the IRS, as a matter of procedure, may well actually institute very much an audit. Now, what will that mean? Well, it will mean that the government of Sweden is going to have to go through and look at the entirety of the Watchtower's financial books. Now, of course, the Watchtower may try to do its tried and true method of, I believe, as the Swedish and Norwegian people have stated, to stonewall and then appeal. That doesn't work against a tax agency. You see, attempting to stonewall a tax agency actually tells them that you have something to hide. And I would imagine, just like in the United States, if you attempt to try and stonewall the IRS, I'm very sure that the Swedish equivalent is going to be not very understanding about it. In fact, it's very likely that just like our American friends and my personal countrymen, I'm pretty sure that our Swedish tax collecting friends are going to very much charge them with things like obstruction of an investigation if they attempt it. And what does that mean, by the way? Well, because they have never been audited, it means that not only will the Swedish tax collection agency, an enforcement agency, be looking at their books for last year, they may well look at their books through the entirety of their service and operation of Sweden. That means every year becomes, how should we say, like rings in a tree, to be carefully peeled apart and examined. This means that every transaction now comes under scrutiny. Every investment, every donation taken, every single one. And in the case of Sweden, in fact, because Sweden actually provides supplements and supplementary income to those religions that are registered as religions in their country, it also means that Sweden is going to be asking some very hard questions as to what the watchtower was doing with their money. And in fact, this might shock you, but it turns out that not telling the truth about what these donations are for and what the organization is doing with those donations is a federal crime, at least here in the United States. And the funniest thing is, I can't imagine that it's any different in Sweden. You see, funny thing about that, in America in particular, we do have actual laws that state that when you solicit for donations and then promptly use those donations to invest money or potentially increase one's own wealth, that becomes a little something called private inurement. Not only that, but it's also classified as misuse of charitable funding and donations. It comes off as, well, a whole bag of worms, actually. Just all sorts of different things. None of them spell anything good for the watchtower. You see, the watchtower's only reason that they're able to kind of do this without Uncle Sam or any government really saying anything to them is literally because it is, in fact, procedure for tax agencies to simply not audit tax-exempt organizations. However, now that the watchtower is no longer a tax-exempt organization in Sweden, they are very much likely to get audited. And stated before, once audited, everything the watchtower has done up to that point will come to light. Every single transaction, every single financial thing ever done by the watchtower, every donation taken, every bit of investment, every bit of kingdom halls that have been constructed using donated labor, donated materials, money from donations, and then promptly sold for profit by the watchtower would then come to light. A story then would be told effectively by these books that what the watchtower really is a corporation masquerading as a religion. A business using religion as a cover to mask its own wealth, effectively taking advantage of its followers, of its individual members to mask its own value. The whole while telling them that what they're paying for isn't corporate investments. They're not paying for-profit ventures by the watchtower. They're paying for Kingdom Hall maintenance. They're paying for the global preaching work, disaster relief. Even though disaster relief, according to the Watchtower's own Shepherding the Flock book, is apparently no longer something that they really do. In fact, the Shepherding the Flock book points out and instructs elders to send members to other charities. By the way, is from the Shepherding the Flock book, which you can actually find available for download on avoidjw.org. Well, that's a pretty picture. So basically, effectively, for lack of a better term, it would appear that the Watchtower very much is using donated funds to pretty much enrich themselves. Something that once the Swedish version of the IRS actually digs into is going to become somewhat pretty apparent. And the funny thing is that, as I've stated before, that in a lot of countries it's kind of illegal for them to do. And once one country finds out this activity, they tend to share this information to every other country that this kind of organization operates in. Which means that this information would then be shared with the United States. It would be shared in France, Germany, everywhere. And in Sweden, well, if they operate much like our own AGs or attorney generals, it's very likely that the Watchtower would not be able to really hide this from their own members, even in Sweden. Because if federal charges are pressed on the Watchtower for this behavior, it's very likely that they would then send a letter detailing these behaviors extensively to each and every JW in Sweden, including ex-JWs. If their AGs are anything like ours, it also means that effectively that Sweden and other countries would be able to seize and or freeze Watchtower assets. The purpose, of course, would be to liquidate these assets to then repay or reparations back to the donors, whether they are current or former members. In this, single stroke would effectively do more damage than any amount of CSA claim or lawsuit that the Watchtower can conveniently hide away. Because the Watchtower can usually hide any kind of CSA lawsuit from information hidden in news articles and the like from witnesses, because they are told directly to not read or look at any kind of material which is critical of the Watchtower. Unfortunately for them in this case, that material would essentially be mailed directly to their door. It's kind of difficult to avoid when you get a letter from the government telling you that the religion and organization that you have been a part of for who knows how many years has been effectively robbing you. Little hard to ignore that. So even if the Watchtower is given a slight slap on the wrist for this, even if they aren't having the whole book thrown at them, and granted, I have a good feeling that probably it might, especially in terms of Sweden itself having literally given taxpayer money to them, might be a little bitter learning that the Watchtower was effectively using taxpayer cash to invest and grow their own wealth. Because I can't lie, but if I was a government official and I found that out, I would also be kind of pissed and quite angry. It is then, therefore, reasonable that if such an audit does exist or happen, that it is very likely that the Swedish officials and basically any official that then conducts their own audit is very likely to then throw the book at them. Now, in the U.S. in particular, the IRS cannot exactly seize necessarily assets or anything like that, but the Attorney General can, and so can the FTC. Now, what exactly could these people potentially face necessarily as legal punishment? Well, in the United States, at least, depending on the severity of things, right? Depending on just how bad the watchtower ends up being in this regard and how much these governments find and the different crimes that may or may not have been committed, there is some very interesting interesting charges that can essentially happen. RICO law violation, which ends up being at a minimum sentence of about 20 years in prison with all assets seized, is one of them. That's not a very fun idea for literally anybody involved. Not only that, but I believe there's also tax fraud, which then comes up to 3 years in fines. Obstruction and evidence tampering, which can be another up to 20 years. Fraud or conspiracy, up to 5 years per count. So, not fun for anybody, especially any JW official that is operating within the United States. And by the way, that's all the potential charges in the United States that might come up if this kind of things would happen. Now, understand that, by the way, the witnesses would not be able to just say, well, it's religious persecution, because other churches have actually been fined and arrested for this. The Church of Scientology executives in the 1970s. The FLDS church leadership. The Archdiocese of Philadelphia versus Lynn. All of this, by the way, shows that not only do governments make a point to keep accountable all religious leaders, not just a few. If Sweden has similar laws and has potentially similar charges and similar sentencing laws, it means that the people in charge of the Swedish branch could very much be looking at close to about 40 or 50 years in prison. If we're going by American legal, but again, that Sweden's different from us. That is a big ouch. And the thing is normally I will say that an audit can take about a couple years. But the thing is that, unfortunately, the Watchtower's usual methods of operation of trying to stonewall an appeal, as I've said before, doesn't work on this. In fact, attempting to stonewall an appeal would actually accelerate investigations and accelerate the pace that these kind of agencies would then push forward to find and press charges. Because, funny thing about that, when you start showing the federal government of any government at all that you have something to hide, or that you have been literally lying to them and straight up taking their money or hiding money that you should actually owe them, it tends to get their attention a bit more, actually, than any other thing in the world can. Which is not going to play well in the governing body's hand. If anything, it's going to play very significantly against them. Especially as each individual country starts doing their own audits and sharing this information. Once you have one country doing an audit, all of them are going to start doing audits. It's going to be a domino effect. Every single one of them is going to start looking into the paperwork to see exactly what the watchtower has been hiding. Which is why, by the way, an audit could very well actually end up being the death of the watchtower. As the organization's straight up intent on deceiving its members and not telling them what they're actually doing with this money, and all of that is going to come very apparent to any tax organization doing any form of investigation. Even if the Watchtower claims that they didn't personally try to deceive, that pales in comparison when you look at the fact that elders have been disfellowshipped for bringing up inconsistencies with financial ledgers. The fact that financial talk in general is discouraged in the kingdom halls when it comes to the finances of the individual kingdom hall or the watchtower in general. This does not play well for anyone attempting to pretend that they are not trying to hide something, that they are not actively trying to, for lack of a better term, lie to donors and individuals who have been giving money to their organization. The Watchtower's normal behavior of shunning those that are critical of them, of silencing dissenting voices, of those who challenge the governing body, and those who have challenged the Watchtower, its teachings, and everything about it, now becomes more of a hindrance than ever before. And in this case, it won't be a thing involving religion concept. In fact, it will simply be a matter of a legal concept of the idea that the Watchtower essentially being hiding or purposely misleading its members into believing that they are donating for a particular cause, when in reality their money is actually being used for something completely different. And it is very unlikely in my mind and in my thought process that any self-respecting person, whether they are JW or ex-JW or the like, would willfully have or donate money to somebody to hide child sexual assault or CSA or sexual assault in general. It is very unlikely to my mind that anybody would want to do something like that. But it is also part and parcel to the Watchtower's own mentality of trying to maintain their image as this quote-unquote quasi-perfect Christian organization that will end up biting them in the rear. Because their lie of omission is still a lie. By not admitting or informing its members of what their money is really being used to spend on, they effectively have run afoul of multiple different charity laws and various other statutes involved. But we're going to have to see how this all plays out. Hopefully we'll see what goes on. We'll see how all this works out. If my only closing statement in this regard is this: if such an audit does occur, if you are a former member in Sweden, or let's say the audit happens in France or Norway or any country where such a thing could possibly happen, I would advise, if you are capable of it, to file, and I know that America does this, I don't know if any other country does this, but it is reasonable that you would be able to file anonymous tips and complaints. And when you do this, by the way, make sure that you include proper evidence. It doesn't have to be airtight, just plausible enough to get the government's attention. If you're worried about retaliation, again, you can thankfully, I know this is a U.S. thing, again, I'm talking about, but you can actually go to their website, fill out a form for a non-compliance complaint when it comes to charity, and as long as you give a letter with a somewhat actually reasonable evidence of your claim, you can essentially provide and help these agencies be able to find and show any sort of criminal behavior or otherwise of any kind of organization like this. But thank you, everybody, and I hope you come back again, and please stop in and say hi. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.